The morning Grace Hawthorne walked into the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell, Kansas. She wore her dead husband's courage like a second skin, because her own had almost run out the night before when she sat alone at the kitchen table staring at a document that threatened to take everything she had left in this world. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishome Trail like a wound that hadn't quite healed, full of cattle dust and whiskey smoke, and the particular kind of desperation that grows in places where men come to make their fortunes and women come to survive them. Grace had arrived in Caldwell 4 years earlier as a young bride of 22, following her husband Thomas Hawthorne west from Missouri with 2 trunks, a cast iron skillet, and a belief in the future that the plains had not yet managed to burn out of her. She was 26 now, and Thomas had been dead 8 months, taken by a fever that moved through the county like a quiet thief, leaving behind 300 acres of good bottomland, a small herd of cattle, a farmhouse that needed a new roof, and a debt to the bank that somebody had decided was more interesting than the widow herself. That somebody was Chester Aldridge. Chester Aldridge was the kind of man who smiled with his teeth, and his eyes stayed completely still, which was a combination Grace had learned to distrust the way she distrusted a clear sky in tornado season. He was the bank manager, the largest landowner in Comanche County outside of the cattle barons who swept through twice a year, and he had been circling the Hawthorne property since before Thomas was even cold in the ground. He had sent representatives, then letters, then representatives again, each time with a lower offer than the last and a more urgent tone, suggesting that Grace's situation was far more precarious than perhaps she understood. Grace understood her situation perfectly. That was why she had spent the last 4 months doing everything she could to keep it from collapsing. She had sold the extra cattle. She had taken on laundry work from the hotel. She had renegotiated the feed bill with Mr. Putnam at the general store, who was a decent man and had given her reasonable terms. She had written to Thomas's brother in St. Louis, who had not written back. She had done everything a woman in 1882 could reasonably do, and she had come close. She had come so terribly close. But the letter that had arrived 2 days ago from the bank had not been about close. It had been about a provision she had not known existed in the original loan documents, a balloon payment clause that Thomas had apparently agreed to and either not told her about or not fully understood himself, and which was now due in full within 30 days. The amount was $460. Grace had 47. So she had put on her best dress, which was charcoal gray and still smelled faintly of the cedar chest. She had packed it away in after the funeral, and she had pinned her dark hair up under her hat, and she had walked the 3 miles into Caldwell because the horse had thrown a shoe, and she could not afford to have it reset until next week. And she had pushed open the door of the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell with her chin up and her hands steady, and her deed to the Hawthorne property tucked into the cloth bag on her arm. The bank was not a large building. It had a teller's cage along the left wall, a writing table in the center of the room, and 3 chairs along the right wall where customers waited. Behind the teller's cage, there was a door that led to Chester Aldridge's office, and it was closed, which meant he was either busy or pretending to be. There were perhaps 7 or 8 other people in the bank that morning, ranchers and merchants settling accounts, a couple of cowboys who had come in from one of the trail drives currently pushing north toward the stockyards. Grace noticed them briefly and then dismissed them from her attention, because she had one purpose today, and it required every bit of focus she possessed. She went to the teller, a young man named Davis who always looked slightly apologetic about everything, and she asked to see Mr. Aldridge. Davis looked at her, then looked at the closed door, then looked back at her with the expression of a man caught between 2 things he was afraid of. "Ma'am, Mr. Aldridge is with someone just now." "I'll wait," Grace said. She sat in one of the chairs along the right wall and folded her hands in her lap and waited. The clock on the wall ticked. The other patrons came and went. One of the cowboys near the back of the room shifted his weight against the wall, and she was faintly aware of him watching her, but she paid him no mind. She was composing what she was going to say in her head, arranging her arguments the way a general arranges troops, because she knew that when that office door opened, she would have one chance, maybe two, and she could not afford to waste a single word. The door opened after 15 minutes. A rancher named Boyle came out looking satisfied with himself, and Chester Aldridge appeared in the doorway in his brown suit with the gold watch chain, and when his eyes found Grace, something moved across his face that was not quite surprise and not quite displeasure, but was somewhere between the two. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "I didn't know you had an appointment." "I don't," Grace said, rising. "But I believe you have 10 minutes before your next one, and I would appreciate the use of them." He considered this for a moment, then stepped back and gestured toward his office with a politeness that had no warmth in it whatsoever. "Come in, then." She went in and sat across from his desk, and did not wait for him to settle himself before she began. She spread the deed on the desk between them, and then placed beside it a piece of paper on which she had written out a detailed accounting of the Hawthorne property's value, its livestock, its land quality, and its current revenue from the small herd she had rebuilt. "I want to talk about the balloon payment clause," she said. Aldridge sat down and looked at the papers with an expression of mild interest, the way a man looks at something he has already decided about. "It's a matter of the contract, Mrs. Hawthorne. The terms were agreed upon." "The terms my husband agreed to without full understanding of what he was signing," Grace said. "Thomas was a good farmer and a good man, but he was not an educated man in the matter of financial instruments. This clause was written in language that obscures its meaning, and I believe you know that." Aldridge's mild expression did not change. "The document is legal and binding." "I am not disputing the legality," Grace said. "I am asking for an extension. 60 days. Possibly 90. My property is worth considerably more than $460, Mr. Aldridge, and you know it. The land alone is worth 3 times the outstanding debt. I'm not a bad risk. I'm a temporary inconvenience." "You're an unaccompanied widow with no male guarantor," Aldridge said, and his voice was perfectly pleasant when he said it, which made it worse. "The bank's policy regarding extensions requires a male co-signatory on any renegotiated terms. It's simply the standard." Grace felt the words land in her chest like a stone dropping into still water, sending out rings of cold. She had known this might be coming. She had prepared for it. But hearing it stated so plainly, so matter-of-factly, as though her entire existence and the 8 months of work she had done to hold her life together were simply insufficient because of what she was, made something hot and fierce rise up in her throat. "I see," she said, and her voice was very controlled and very quiet. "And if I were to bring you the $460 within 30 days, with no extension needed, would that satisfy the terms?" "Of course," Aldridge said. "Cash payment in full closes the matter entirely. And if I cannot," he leaned forward just slightly, "then the property reverts to the bank, which will of course compensate you for any equity above the debt amount." He paused. "I've spoken with several interested buyers already. I believe I could move it quickly. You'd have enough to start fresh somewhere. Kansas City, perhaps. There's more opportunity for a woman in your situation in a city." The dismissal in that last sentence was so complete, so practiced, that Grace understood she was not the first woman who had sat in this chair and been told that her life's work was an inconvenience to be efficiently resolved. She gathered her papers. She did it slowly and deliberately, because she would not let him see her hands shake. She put the deed back into her cloth bag. She rose from the chair. "I will have your answer within a week, Mr. Aldridge," she said. "Of course," he said, and stood, and was already reaching for something else on his desk before she had turned to leave. She walked back out into the main room of the bank. Her boots were quiet on the wooden floor. The clock ticked. The teller looked at her and looked away. There were still a few people in the room. the cowboys who had been there earlier still occupying the back section near the window. She had almost reached the door when she stopped. She did not know why she stopped. Later she would think about it and decide that some part of her had simply refused to leave, refused to walk out that door and back down that dusty road, and accept what had just been handed to her without at least saying it out loud, without at least making it real in front of witnesses instead of letting it stay quiet and shameful, and sealed in an office where no one could hear. She turned around. "Mr. Aldridge has just informed me," she said, addressing the room at large, her voice carrying clearly to every corner, "that the bank will not consider an extension on my property's loan because I am a widow without a male co-signatory. The property in question has been in my family for 4 years. I have worked that land alone for 8 months since my husband's passing. I have met every previous payment on time, often with sacrifice I will not detail here, and I am asking for 60 days to meet an obligation that was written into my loan documents in language specifically designed to be difficult to understand." The room was very quiet. Davis, the teller, had gone slightly pale. Chester Aldridge had appeared back in his doorway. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, and his voice had lost its pleasantness. "I am speaking," Grace said. She kept her eyes on the room, not on him. "I am telling these people, your customers, what their bank's policy looks like when it is applied to a woman who has done nothing wrong except outlive her husband and have the misfortune of doing so without male relatives nearby. I want it to be clear that I have the deed. I have the right to that land, and I am being told that right is contingent on my finding a man to stand next to me, as though my name on a legal document means nothing without one." The silence stretched. And then, from the back of the room, there was the sound of a chair scraping against the wooden floor, and a man stood up. He was tall, and he had been sitting in a way that had made him seem like just part of the furniture before, the kind of stillness that certain men cultivate when they are watching and waiting, and not yet decided. He wore a plain dark coat over a work shirt, and his hat was in his hands, which he had taken off without anyone noticing when, and his hair was the color of good coffee, and his eyes were gray and clear and fixed on Grace with an expression that was not pity and was not calculation, but was something she had not seen in a long time, which was simple, direct recognition. "My name is Harlan Monroe," he said. He had a voice that was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had no need to rush because it was confident the words would reach wherever they needed to go. "I came in this morning on business of my own, but I heard what this woman said, and I am telling you now that I am with her." The room absorbed this. Chester Aldridge took 2 steps into the main room. "Monroe, you have no stake in this." "I have a stake in fairness," Harlan said. He said it the way you say something that is simply true and requires no elaboration. He looked at Grace then, and there was a question in his eyes that was also an offer, patient and genuine, and waiting for her answer. Grace Hawthorne had spent the last 8 months learning to accept help from no one, because help had come with conditions or with pity or with implications about what she would owe afterward, and she had decided early on that she would rather break herself than be bent by someone else's charity. But this man's face had none of those things. He was looking at her the way a person looks at another person they have simply decided to stand beside, without a ledger, without a tally. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and crossed the room to stand beside her, not in front of her, not between her and Aldridge, but beside her, and the difference was not lost on Grace, and it was not lost on anyone else in the room either. Chester Aldridge looked at Harlan Monroe for a long moment. Harlan Monroe looked back, and there was something in his stillness that was not threatening in an obvious way but conveyed very clearly that he had made a decision and was not going to be argued out of it by any means that Aldridge was likely to have available. "My office is not a public forum," Aldridge said at last. "No," Harlan said, "but this room is, and it seems to me that Mrs. Hawthorne's situation has moved into this room whether you intended it to or not." Aldridge turned to Grace. His pleasant manner was completely gone now, and what replaced it was a flat, businesslike coldness. "The terms of the loan are as I stated, Mrs. Hawthorne. If you wish to discuss them further with a representative present, you may schedule an appointment." "She does not need a representative," Harlan said. "She needs the bank to honor a fair request. 60 days is nothing against a piece of property that is worth 3 times the debt, and you know it." There was a long silence. The other patrons in the bank had not moved. They were all watching with the careful attention of people who sense that something important is happening and do not want to miss the shape of it. Aldridge looked around the room. He was a man who understood social mathematics, who always knew what his position was in any given arrangement, and Grace could see him calculating now, running the numbers on what it would cost him in the community to refuse publicly against what it would cost him privately to concede. The 2 cowboys she had noticed earlier were watching with open interest. The rancher who had been at the writing table had turned fully around. 10 days, Aldridge said finally. "I will give you a 10-day extension to arrange the payment or find alternative financing. That is the extent of what I am able to offer under current policy, and it is more than is required." "That's not enough," Grace said immediately. "The property needs 60 days and you know it. 10 days is designed to fail." Harlan spoke quietly but clearly. "If the bank forecloses on this woman's property through a clause that any reasonable person would recognize as predatory, I expect that story would be of considerable interest to the Land Commissioner's office in Wichita, and I happen to know the Land Commissioner personally." That was not entirely true, as Grace would learn much later. Harlan knew of the Land Commissioner, had met him once briefly at a cattle auction in Dodge City 2 years prior, and could not have said with any certainty that the man would remember him. But he said it with such measured confidence that there was no way for Aldridge to know whether it was a bluff or not, and that uncertainty was its own kind of leverage. Aldridge's jaw tightened. 30 days, he said. "That is my final offer, and it is being extended as a courtesy, not an obligation." Grace looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at her. She gave him the smallest nod. 30 days, she said. "In writing, signed today with no additional conditions." Aldridge looked like he had swallowed something unpleasant, but he turned and went back into his office, and a few minutes later Davis, the teller, came out with a document, and Grace signed it and took her copy, and folded it carefully and put it in her cloth bag next to the deed. And then she walked out of the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell, Kansas, and Harlan Monroe walked out beside her. The sunlight outside was sharp and bright, and the main street of Caldwell was busy with its ordinary mid-morning business. Wagons and horses, and the smell of dust and manure and fresh bread from the bakery 2 doors down. And Grace stood on the boardwalk for a moment and breathed it in and felt her legs finally, truly shake. The way they had been threatening to the entire time she was inside, and had not been allowed to. Harlan stood a respectful distance away, and did not comment on the fact that her hands were gripping the strap of her cloth bag with an intensity that was probably leaving marks. "That was very well done," he said after a moment. Grace looked at him. Up close he was somewhat older than she had initially thought. Not old, perhaps 30 or 31, with a lean, weathered quality to his face that came from years outdoors, and a scar along his jaw that was old enough to be just part of the landscape of him. His eyes, she decided, were not quite gray but something between gray and green, the color of sage after rain. "I should ask you," she said, "whether you actually know the Land Commissioner." The corner of his mouth moved. "I know of him." "That is considerably different." "It is," he agreed, "but Aldridge doesn't know how different." Grace considered this. "What is your business in Caldwell, Mr. Monroe?" "Horses," he said. "I have a small spread about 12 miles northeast near the county line. I've been building up a breeding operation for the last 2 years. I came into town this morning to talk to Frank Delano about buying some of his pasture on the East End, but he wasn't available, so I was waiting." He paused. "I had not planned to get involved in a banking dispute." "No," Grace said. "I imagine you hadn't." She hesitated. The 30 days sat in her cloth bag like a stone. Thank you. What you did in there, it wasn't a small thing, and I won't pretend it was. You could have ignored it. I could have, he said. Most people did. Most people always do, Harlan said, and there was no judgment in it, just a statement of fact. Can I ask, Mrs. Hawthorne, how close you are to making the payment? She was silent for a moment. There was no reason to tell him the truth. There was no reason to tell him anything. He had done what he had done, and that was complete in itself, and she owed him nothing and he owed her nothing, and they could go their separate ways right now, and the morning would still have been what it was. I have $47, she said, and a farm with some cattle, a kitchen garden, and 30 days to come up with 413 more. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what kind of cattle? She almost laughed. Longhorns mostly. I sold the rest of the herd last fall to cover the winter expenses. I have 9 head remaining. What are you asking per head? She looked at him. Are you offering to buy my cattle, Mr. Monroe? I'm asking what you're asking per head, he said. There is a difference. She named her price. He nodded slowly, in the way a man nods when the price is fair and he has no interest in haggling for its own sake, which she found she respected enormously. I'll take the 9 head, he said. I can send someone by with a draft tomorrow morning. That would bring me to, she calculated quickly in her head, about $240. Yes, he said. You'd still need another 220, and some change. Yes, she said. He was quiet again, looking out at the street with his hat still in his hands. She noticed that he held it the way someone holds something they've had for a long time and are completely comfortable with, easy and unhurried. I know a cattle buyer out of Wichita, Harlan said, who is looking specifically for bottomland grazing access this season. If your property has the pasture you're describing, you might be able to negotiate a grazing lease. Short term, 60 or 90 days. The money would be up front. Grace felt something move in her chest that was not quite hope, because hope was too fragile and she had stopped trusting it, but was something in the same neighborhood. How much would that bring? Depends on the acreage and the quality of the grass. If your bottomland is as good as you described to Aldridge, I'd say somewhere between $150 and $250 for a summer lease. That might cover it, Grace said carefully. It might, Harlan agreed. Do you want me to send word to the buyer? I can do it today if you give me the particulars of the property. She looked at him for a long moment. He was watching her with those gray-green eyes, and there was patience in them. No urgency, no performance, just a man waiting to see what she would decide. Why are you doing this? She asked. He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated more than a quick answer would have given her. Because what I saw in there wasn't right, he said finally. And I have had enough years watching things that aren't right happen without anyone stopping them. I'm tired of being one of the people who doesn't stop them. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, My property is on the South Fork Road, 3 miles east of the Clearwater Crossing. 300 acres, about 60 of which are prime bottomland along the creek. The rest is good pasture and some timber. The house and outbuildings are in reasonable condition. The well is good. He nodded, committing it to memory. I'll write to the buyer today. I can repay you, she said quickly. For the referral, for any time you spend on this, I want to be clear that I am not Mrs. Hawthorne, he said, and there was something gentle but firm in the interruption. Let's see if it works first, and then we can talk about what anyone owes anyone. Right now it's just a letter. She closed her mouth, nodded. He put his hat on. It suited him, she thought, which was a foolish thing to notice, and she set the observation aside immediately. I'll be out your way tomorrow morning with the draft for the cattle, he said. If that's agreeable. That's agreeable, she said. He touched the brim of his hat, a small, courteous gesture, and turned and walked back up the main street toward the livery, and Grace watched him go for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then turned and walked the 3 miles home. The farm was quieter without the larger herd. She felt it every time she came home, the particular silence of a place that used to have more life in it. She fed the remaining cattle and checked on the kitchen garden, which was coming in well despite the dry spring, and she made herself eat supper, because she had learned early on that a body running on grief and no food was a body that made poor decisions, and she needed her decisions to be excellent for the next 30 days. She lay in bed that night and thought about Harlan Monroe and the way you examine something unexpected, turning it over, looking at it from different angles. There was a quality to his presence that she had not encountered in a while, something solid and direct and without agenda. She had met men in the past 8 months who had offered to help her, and whose help came attached to suggestions about what her future ought to look like, meaning their version of it, with them in it in ways she had not invited. Harlan had not suggested anything about her future except that it might still contain her farm. She fell asleep thinking about the pasture lease and woke up thinking about it too, already mentally moving the cattle to their best grazing positions, the ones that would show the land to maximum advantage when the buyer came to look. Harlan Monroe arrived the following morning at 8 o'clock on a bay horse and with a younger man, a ranch hand named Eli, who helped with the cattle. He brought the draft as promised, made out for the full amount they had agreed on, and he examined each of the 9 longhorns with the quiet attention of a man who knows cattle and does not need to perform knowing them, just looking, noting, making his own assessment. "These are good animals," he said, which was a plain statement and not a compliment manufactured for her benefit, which somehow made it better. "Thomas had a good eye for stock," Grace said. Harlan nodded. He looked at her then, and there was something in his face that acknowledged the mention of her husband without making it awkward or stilted. "I sent the letter to the buyer last night. His name is Cowboy out of Wichita. I expect I'll hear back within a week." "Thank you," she said. He seemed in no particular hurry to leave, and she was not in any particular hurry to send him away, which surprised her somewhat. She offered him coffee because it was basic hospitality, and not because she wanted an excuse to keep him there. She told herself, and she told herself very firmly. They sat on the porch and drank coffee and looked out over the bottomland where the creek ran silver in the morning light, and he asked her about the property in the way a person asks about something they are genuinely interested in: how long the creek ran reliable, what the summer temperature did to the grass quality, whether there was flooding in the spring. She answered all of it in full because she knew her land the way you know a person you have lived closely with for years, all its moods and habits and specific qualities, and she found that talking about it steadied her in a way that little else had lately. He told her about his own spread in return, not with the self-promotion of a man trying to impress, but with the matter-of-fact descriptiveness of someone sharing information that seemed relevant to the conversation. He had come to Kansas from Texas 2 years before, following the horses rather than the cattle, having developed a specific interest in breeding quarter horses for ranch work, and eventually, he hoped, for the Army contracts that were getting harder and harder for the bigger breeders to monopolize. He had 40 horses currently, had sold 12 in the last year at prices he was satisfied with, and was looking to expand his grazing acreage, which was why he had been trying to see Frank Delano. "Did Delano come through?" Grace asked. "I haven't been back," Harlan said. "I've been occupied." He said it without inflection, and she was not entirely sure whether he meant occupied with the cattle purchase or with writing the letter or with something else, and she did not ask. Eli had loaded the cattle into a temporary pen attached to the lead rope of the trail horse by then, and Harlan stood to go. He finished his coffee and set the cup down with the same unhurried economy of movement that she had noticed about him in the bank, as though he was someone who did not spend energy unnecessarily. "I'll send word when I hear from Calloway," he said. "I'll be here," Grace said. He rode away with the cattle and Eli, and Grace went back inside and put Harlan Monroe's draft in the cash box and stood in her kitchen and felt $47 become $240, which was still not enough but was considerably more possible. The week that followed was a working week in the truest sense. She replanted the south section of the kitchen garden, which had been eaten by deer, and repaired the fence that had allowed the eating. She patched 2 sections of the roof that had been troubling her since winter, getting up there herself with the tools and the tar paper because she could not afford to pay someone, and also because she had decided some months ago that there was no point in waiting for things to be done by someone else when she was perfectly capable of doing them herself. She did the laundry for the hotel, 3 loads on Monday, which brought her another $4. On Wednesday, Harlan Monroe appeared at her gate on foot, which surprised her because 12 miles was not a short walk, and she said so. "I rode the horse to the Delano place," he said. "Got the acreage sorted out. That's on the east side. Your place is on the way back." She opened the gate. "You heard from Calloway." "This morning," he said, and he was smiling, which she had not seen before, and it changed his face considerably, making it warmer and younger and more open. "He's interested. He wants to ride out and see the land on Friday, if that suits you." "Friday suits me perfectly," Grace said, and she felt the weight shift just slightly on her shoulders, the particular adjustment of a burden when you can begin to see the possibility of setting it down. "He's a fair man," Harlan said. "Businesslike but fair. He won't lowball you if the land is what you say it is. And from what I saw last week, the land is better." She looked at him. "You're very certain about other people's land." "I looked at it for an hour over coffee," he said. "That's enough to see quality." She invited him in for supper because he had walked to Delano's and was on his way back 12 miles, and it was nearly evening, and turning down a man who had just brought her good news and was also hungry seemed like poor return for kindness. He sat at her kitchen table, and she made biscuits and beans and fried the last of the salt pork, and they ate together with the particular ease of 2 people who have somehow skipped past the stiff introductory stages of acquaintance and arrived somewhere more comfortable without fully deciding to. They talked about a great many things. About Kansas in the spring, which they both thought was the best season for the plains. That particular quality of light before the summer heat pressed everything flat and gold. About horses, which he knew and she knew less about but was curious. About Texas, which he had come from and which he described with the affectionate impatience of someone who has left a place they loved without fully resolving how they feel about having left it. About Missouri, which she had come from and which she missed in the specific and limited way you miss somewhere that shaped you but could no longer hold you. He asked about Thomas carefully, in the way someone asks about a sore place when they are genuinely curious but genuinely careful, and she answered in the way she had learned to answer, which was honestly and without making it a performance. Thomas had been a good man, she said, steady and kind and not afraid of work. Not a brilliant man, not a complicated man, but a good one, and she had loved him in the uncomplicated way you love someone you trust completely, which was its own kind of richness. Harlan listened without comment, and his listening was the quality of attention that makes a person feel fully heard rather than simply waited out, which she thought was rare. She asked about him. Whether there had been a wife. He was quiet for a moment. "There was," he said. 6 years ago in Texas, she died in childbirth, the child too." "I'm sorry," Grace said. "It's been a long time," he said, "but it changes you." "Yes," she said, "it does." They sat in the quiet of that for a moment, 2 people who had each lost someone and knew the specific texture of that kind of grief, and the shared knowing of it made the quiet between them something comfortable rather than something empty. After supper, he helped her carry the dishes to the washing basin, which she did not ask for, and was not going to tell him was unnecessary because it wasn't, and then he took his leave and said he would be back Friday morning to make the introduction to Calloway. Thursday passed in a fever of preparation. She walked every inch of the bottomland pasture, clearing debris from the creek bank, checking fence lines, making sure the best sections of grass were visible and accessible. She was filthy by the end of it and satisfied in the way physical work makes you satisfied, and she slept better Thursday night than she had in weeks. Calloway arrived Friday morning in a wagon with Harlan on horseback beside him, and he was exactly as Harlan had described, a square, businesslike man in his 50s with sharp eyes and no interest in small talk, who dismounted and immediately began walking the land with the focused assessment of a professional evaluator. Grace walked with him and answered every question he asked with the same precision and calm she had brought to the bank, because the land was her argument and she knew it. After 2 hours, Calloway made her an offer of $220 for a 90-day summer grazing lease. She counteroffered $240. They settled at $230. She would have $240 from the cattle purchase and $230 from the lease. That was $470. She needed $460. She stood in her own bottomland in the bright May sunshine and looked at the number and felt it land in her bones with a precision that was almost physical. $10 to spare. After everything, $10 to spare. Calloway shook her hand with the firm, professional grip of someone who does business with women, when the business makes sense and finds no particular reason to comment on it, and she liked him for that. When he drove back toward the road, Harlan was still on his horse, and he was watching her with those sage-rain eyes and a small smile. "You did that yourself," he said. "I just made the introduction." "You did considerably more than that," Grace said, "and you know it." He shook his head, but the smile stayed. She looked up at him. The sunlight was hitting the side of his face, and she had a sudden, clear awareness of him that was entirely different from gratitude. A pulling, warm thing in her chest that she recognized immediately and immediately tried to put in a box, because she had no framework for it right now, and 30 days was not enough time to build one. "Come back on Saturday," she said. "I'd like to cook a proper supper as a thank you." He looked at her for a moment with those careful eyes. "Supper as a thank you," he said, "or supper because you'd like company." She lifted her chin slightly. "Both." "Saturday then," he said, and turned his horse toward the road. She paid the bank 12 days early, walking into the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell on the 17th day of her 30-day window with $460 in cash and a receipt book. And she stood at Davis's teller cage while he counted it and wrote her the discharge of the balloon payment and stamped it with the bank's seal. And Chester Aldridge watched from the doorway of his office with an expression that was not gracious but was defeated. And Grace looked at him directly and said nothing at all, because she did not need to. She had her deed free and clear. She walked out of that bank in her charcoal dress with the stamped discharge in her cloth bag and stood in the May sunshine and felt something in her chest open like a door that had been stuck for a very long time. Harlan came on Saturday as he had said he would, and the supper was not just a thank-you dinner and was not just company and was not just two neighbors being decent to each other. And they both knew it, even though neither of them said anything about it directly. She made a roast chicken and corn bread and a dried apple pie that was one of the better things she had ever baked, and they sat at the kitchen table until the evening was full dark outside and talked about everything and nothing with the particular ease of people who have discovered they are interested in each other's minds. He came the following Saturday too, and the one after that. By the third Saturday she had stopped thinking of it as anything other than what it was, which was Harlan Monroe coming to her table because he wanted to be there, and she wanting him there, and the wanting being mutual and unhurried and real. They took to riding in the evenings, which meant that she had to get the horse's shoe fixed, which she did with part of the $10 she had left over, and they rode along the creek road in the long summer dusk with the fireflies just beginning and the prairie grass silver in the fading light. He was teaching her about horses, the specific knowledge of them, how to read a horse's mood from its ears, how to assess a gait, what the different conformations meant for different kinds of work. She was teaching him, without meaning to, how to talk about something he cared about without armor. She noticed that when he spoke about the horses he loved, his voice changed in a way that was not entirely self-conscious, and that he would catch it sometimes and pull back, and she began gently, over weeks, to let him know that the pulling back was unnecessary. "You love this," she said one evening, watching him describe a particular quarter horse mare he had recently acquired, a gray roan with exceptional hindquarters and an unusual temperament, patient and spirited at once, which he seemed to find personally significant. "I do," he said, and he said it simply, without qualification, which she recognized as a small thing he was allowing himself. Summer came in fully, and the Callaway cattle were on her bottomland, and the money was settled, and the deed was clear, and she began to see the shape of the future again in a way that she had not been able to since the fever had taken Thomas 8 months before. She began to fix the things that needed fixing. The roof was fully patched. The south fence was rebuilt. She started saving again in the careful, methodical way of someone who has learned what disaster looks like and wants enough distance between herself and it. Harlan's horse operation was going well. He had sold 6 horses at good prices to a cavalry remount agent out of Fort Dodge, and his reputation was beginning to spread in the way that genuine quality spreads, slowly at first, and then with momentum. He talked about expanding, about needing more pasture, about his vision for what the operation could become in 5 years. She listened to these conversations with great attention, because she was interested, and because she noticed that his vision of the future was detailed and vivid when he talked about it with her. More detailed than she suspected. He let it be with most people, as though her listening gave the vision permission to expand. On an August evening, very warm still at 7 o'clock, they were sitting on the porch and the creek was audible at the bottom of the field, and the fireflies were intense, and Grace was watching them and thinking about nothing in particular when Harlan said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him. He was looking at his hands, which was unusual for him. He was generally a direct person. "When I stood up in that bank," he said, "I told you I did it because I was tired of not stopping things that aren't right." He paused. "That was true, but it wasn't the whole of it." She waited. "I'd seen you before that morning," he said, 3 weeks before at the general store. You were arguing with Putnam about the feed bill. You weren't loud about it, but you were absolutely not going to move, and he knew it. And eventually he figured out a fair arrangement because you were right, and you knew you were right, and you were going to stand there until he acknowledged it. Grace remembered the conversation. She had not noticed anyone watching. "I didn't think much of it," Harlan said, "except that I thought, that is a person who does not waste herself on things that don't matter. And then I was in the bank and I heard your voice and I knew who you were before I looked up, and I stood up because you were right, and also because," he stopped. She was very still. "Because I wanted to," he said. "I wanted to be the person who stood up for you." The fireflies moved in the dark grass below the porch, and the creek talked to itself in the distance, and Grace Hawthorne felt her heart, which had been very carefully managed for 8 months, do something that was not careful at all. "Harlan," she said. "You don't have to," he began. "I'm not finished," she said quietly. "When you walked out of that bank beside me, I told myself it was just kindness. When you bought the cattle, I told myself it was just business. When you brought Callaway, I told myself it was just a neighborly gesture. I told myself these things because I was not ready to think about what it actually was." He was looking at her now. "What actually was it?" he asked, and his voice was very quiet. "Something I wasn't expecting," she said. "Someone I wasn't expecting." He reached across the small distance between their chairs and put his hand over hers, and it was the kind of touch that is both tentative and certain at once, asking and answering in the same gesture. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that in the warm August dark for a long time, neither of them saying anything more, because what had just been said was enough, and they were both people who understood the value of not filling a good silence. The weeks that followed had a different quality to them, lighter and more complicated at the same time, the way things get when you have admitted something true and then have to figure out how to live inside the truth of it. They were careful with each other and also less careful, which sounds contradictory, but is the experience of most people who are falling in love when they are old enough to know what they're doing. He brought her a book he had picked up in Wichita on a business trip, a novel she had mentioned in passing months ago that she had never been able to find in Caldwell's small general store. And the fact that he had remembered the title and the author and found it, and carried it 12 miles, was the kind of thing that broke a careful person's heart in the best possible way. She fixed a new bridle for his gray roan mare using leather skills she had learned from Thomas, worked it into shape over 3 evenings by lamplight, and brought it out to his place the following Friday when she rode over for the first time, and watched his face when he saw it. "You made this," he said. "Thomas kept all the tools," she said. "Seemed a waste not to use them." He looked at the bridle for a long moment and then at her, and there was something in his expression that was complete and warm and sure of itself. She saw his operation for the first time that Friday, the horses in the pasture, the barn he had built himself with good seasoned lumber, the small tight house that was clean and sparely furnished in the way of a person who is not attached to objects but knows how to care for the ones they have. She walked through it with him and felt the shape of his life in a way that words over supper had not quite given her. "What do you think?" he asked, standing in the barn doorway while she watched the gray roan move in the near pasture. "I think you're building something real," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am." She looked at him and understood that he was not only talking about the horses. In September, 2 things happened that changed the shape of what was between them more quickly than the slow, careful summer had managed to. The first was Chester Aldridge. He appeared at Grace's farm on a Tuesday morning with a man she did not know, a lawyer type in a good suit, and he stood at her gate with the pleasant overcold smile back in full force, and explained that he had been reviewing the property records and had identified a discrepancy in the original survey of the Hawthorne property that he believed might affect the legal description in the deed. Grace stood on her porch and felt a cold clarity move through her. "The deed has been discharged of debt," she said. "The bank has no claim." "The bank," Aldridge said, "is not the party raising the concern. I am raising it personally, as an interested citizen with knowledge of the county land records. The discrepancy, if validated, could cloud the title. It would need to go before the county recorder. These things take time." She understood immediately what was happening. He had lost the direct approach and was now trying the indirect one. The survey discrepancy, real or manufactured, was a way to create uncertainty in the title, which would make it difficult for her to sell, lease, or use the property as security for anything, without touching the deed discharge itself. She kept her voice level. "I would want to see the documentation of this discrepancy." "My lawyer will be in contact," Aldridge said pleasantly. She went inside and wrote a letter to Harlan Monroe and sent it with a boy from the adjacent farm to deliver it, because she was not going to ride to his place in a panic and she was not going to sit and do nothing either. He was at her farm within 2 hours. He read the letter and she watched his face go through several things quickly, ending on a controlled, focused anger that was quiet and utterly serious. "This is harassment," he said. "It is," she agreed. "But harassment with a legal mechanism." "Who do you know on the county recorder's side?" he asked. She thought. "Mrs. Delano, Frank Delano's wife. She works as the deputy recorder's secretary." "That's a start," he said. "I need to see the original survey records. If Aldridge is inventing a discrepancy, there will be nothing in the records to support it, and we can get it dismissed before it gets filed. If he has actually found something, it's more complicated, but manufactured clouds on titles are notoriously hard to sustain against an owner who is paying attention." He paused. "And you are very good at paying attention." "I want to go to the recorder's office myself," she said. "I will not have this done for me or around me." "Of course," he said, without hesitation. They went to the recorder's office the following morning together, and Mrs. Delano, who was a small, efficient woman who had no particular love for Chester Aldridge and made no secret of it, pulled the original survey records for the Hawthorne property and the adjacent parcels and laid them on the table for Grace and Harlan to examine. The original survey was entirely clear. The boundaries were well documented, the markers were recorded accurately, and there was no discrepancy in the legal description. The property was exactly what the deed said it was. Harlan made a handwritten copy of the key sections of the survey, and Grace, signed it as a certified true copy, witnessed by Mrs. Delano, and they took it back to town and posted a written response to Aldridge's lawyer through the proper channels, citing the specific survey records and noting that any further attempts to cloud the title on grounds unsupported by the county records would be treated as a matter for the district court. They heard nothing more from Aldridge. It was on the ride back from the recorder's office that the second thing happened. They were about 2 miles out of town on the road toward her property, the afternoon warm and golden with September light, when Harlan pulled his horse alongside her and was quiet for a moment in a way that had a shape to it, a considered, decided quality, and Grace looked at him and waited. "I don't want to overstep," he said. "You have never once overstepped," she said. "I'm about to," he said. "So I wanted to acknowledge it first." She kept her horse even with his. The road ran between 2 fields of late-season grass, heavy and amber, and a hawk was working the thermals high to the east. "I have been thinking," Harlan said, "about the fact that my pasture and your bottomland together would make the finest horse operation in this county, possibly in this part of the state." He paused. "I've also been thinking about other things. The fact that I have spent the better part of this summer looking for reasons to be where you are. The fact that when Aldridge came to your gate, the thing I felt was not neighborly concern." He stopped. Grace's heart was doing the thing it had been doing since August, the uncareful thing, but she said nothing yet. "I have been thinking," he said, "that I would like to ask you something, and I want to ask it clearly because I think you deserve clarity and not hints." "Then ask it clearly," she said. He looked at her with those sage-rain eyes that had looked at her in the bank all those months ago with simple, direct recognition. "Will you marry me, Grace?" The hawk turned a long, slow circle in the afternoon sky. The grass moved in a light wind that came from the north, carrying the first cool edge of the season that would be coming. Grace Hawthorne, who was 26 years old and had buried a good man and saved her own land and learned to repair fences and dress leather and argue with bank managers and stand in her own rightness, looked at Harlan Monroe and felt the future open up in a direction she had not been looking in, wide and possible and real. "Yes," she said, "I will." He looked at her for a long moment, and the smile that moved across his face was not the quick one she had seen before, but something slower and deeper, a smile that came from somewhere that had been closed for a while and was now opening. He reached across the distance between their horses, and she reached too, and they held hands in the middle of the road, with the amber grass on both sides and the hawk overhead, and neither of them said anything for a long moment because there was nothing that needed saying. They were married in November of 1882, on a cold, bright day with the first snow of the season on the ground and the creek frozen at the edges, in the small Methodist church in Caldwell that smelled of wood polish and candle wax, and the pine boughs that Mrs. Delano had put up along the windows because she had decided, independently and without being asked, that the occasion deserved decoration. There were not many guests. The Delanos were there. Frank Putnam from the general store, who had come to have a genuine respect for Grace in the months since she had argued him into fair terms, and his wife. Eli, Harlan's ranch hand, who had turned out to be 20 years old and genuinely decent, and was clearly delighted by the whole affair. A few of the neighboring farmers who had come to know them both over the summer and fall. Cowboy, the cattle buyer from Wichita, had sent a letter of congratulation from Kansas City where he was on business. Grace wore a dress she had made herself from fabric Harlan had brought from Wichita, a deep blue-green wool that was the color she had thought of when she first recognized the shade of his eyes. She wore her hair down, partly because it was her wedding day and she felt she was allowed, and partly because she had learned that Harlan had a specific, unguarded quality of expression he got when he saw her hair down, something warm and slightly undone, that she liked very much. He was in a dark suit that fit him well, and he had managed to appear in the church clean-shaved and neat, and was standing at the front with his hands clasped, and a stillness that was not nervous but was intent. And when she came through the door, he looked at her, with an expression that was so direct and full that she felt it across the length of the church, and had to look away for a moment at the pine boughs to collect herself. The minister asked the words and they said the answers, and when the ring went on her finger she looked at it for a moment. A plain gold band that he had been carrying in his vest pocket for 2 weeks, as she would learn later, afraid to put it somewhere he might lose it. And she thought about what a ring meant, what beginning something meant when you had already had a beginning and a middle and a terrible ending. And she thought that there was something that was not a betrayal of the first ring in accepting the second. That there was enough room in a life for more than one true thing. They rode back to the farm that evening, her farm, which was now also his, and he had arranged for Eli to bring his most important belongings over during the week so that the moving would be gradual and not disruptive, which was exactly the right decision, and showed a quality of attention to her comfort that she had come to expect from him and would never quite stop being grateful for. The first winter of their marriage was the hardest and the warmest simultaneously. Hard because the Plains winter of 1882 to 1883 was severe, long stretches of cold that tested the infrastructure of any farm, and they lost one of the horses to colic in January, which was a real financial setback for Harlan's breeding program, and the creek froze solid in February, and they had to carry water from the well for the animals for 6 weeks, which was exhausting work in the cold. Warm because they were together in it. There was a specific quality of winter on the plains when you are alone in it, and when you have someone beside you, and the difference is not merely practical but fundamental. She had known a winter alone, and she knew this winter, and the comparison was not available to her to forget. They worked well together in the way that people work well when they respect each other's competence and do not need to establish authority because it is simply obvious who knows what in which area. She knew the farm, the bottomland, the cattle, the kitchen garden, the schedules and rhythms of the property. He knew the horses, the business side of the breeding operation, the wider network of buyers and agents and contacts that his work required. They consulted each other on everything and deferred to each other's expertise naturally, without hierarchy, which Grace found was the way she had always wanted a partnership to work, and was, she suspected, the way Harlan had always imagined it should work too. They talked about the injustice of what she had faced in that bank, not just once but in the way that a significant thing gets talked about over time, in pieces, as different aspects of it become relevant to different moments. He told her once in the early spring when they were coming back from Caldwell after a trip to the land recorder to register the formal joining of their properties that he had thought about that morning in the bank for weeks before he had met her again. There were 8 other people in that room, he said, and no one else stood up. People have reasons, she said. She was not making an excuse for them. It was simply what she had come to understand. They do, he said. But the reasons are usually about not wanting to be inconvenient to themselves, which is understandable and also not good enough. She looked at him. You were never afraid of being inconvenient. I was, he said. I was afraid of it for a long time. I spent a lot of years in Texas and on the trail watching things happen that I didn't like and finding reasons not to interfere. I got tired of the reasons. He paused. You were not a reason. You were just right. She reached across the wagon seat and put her hand on his arm, and he covered it with his hand, and they drove back toward home in the late afternoon light with the joined deeds in the bag between them. Spring came in 1883 with a generosity that felt almost apologetic for the winter, long warm days, and rain at the right intervals, and the creek running full and clear. The bottomland grass was exceptional that year, thick and deep, and Callaway came back with an offer for another summer grazing lease, this time offering $260 before she had even countered, because he knew what he had found the year before and was not interested in losing it. Harlan's breeding operation had its best season. He sold 11 horses at prices that exceeded his previous best, including a sale to a military remount agent that established a connection he had been working toward for a year. He began talking, with increasing specificity, about a second barn. They built it together over the summer, Eli and two other hired hands doing the heavy timber work, Grace and Harlan working alongside them. And there was a day in July when she was up on the frame wall driving a nail, and he was below handing up lumber, and he looked up at her and started laughing. Not at anything in particular. Just a full, warm laugh that she had learned was rare for him, and was therefore remarkable every time. And she looked down at him with her hammer in her hand and thought that she had not expected this specific shape of happiness, and was terrified and grateful in equal measure that she had found it. In the late summer of 1883, she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, early, while he was drinking his first coffee, and she was standing by the window watching the light come up over the eastern pasture, and she said it plainly because they were playing with each other about important things. He set his cup down. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see several things move through his face, beginning with a brief, real shadow that she understood was the memory of 6 years ago in Texas, what he had lost then, and then moving through it into something that was present and immediate and his, a warmth and a settled joy that was entirely of this moment and not of any other. He stood up and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her and held her without saying anything for a moment, and she put her face against his shoulder and felt his heart, which was steady and strong and sure. "All right," he said quietly against her hair. "Then we do this carefully and we do this right. We do it the way we do everything," she said. "Yes," he said, "together." He was attentive through the pregnancy without being overbearing, which she would not have tolerated, and he somehow knew without being told. He took on more of the physical work without making a production of it. He arranged for the Wichita doctor, a good one by all accounts, to come out and examine her in the 2nd month and again in the 6th, because Caldwell's local physician was capable, but Harlan was not interested in anything less than capable when it came to this. She was not a fragile woman, and she did not become one during the pregnancy. She continued to work the farm and manage the household, and correspond with Calloway about the lease, and argue pleasantly with Harlan about the placement of the second barn's interior stalls, which she thought should run east-west for the light, and he thought should run north-south for the airflow. And they worked it out by drawing it on paper at the kitchen table, and eventually both conceding one aisle each to the other's preference, which they both agreed was a satisfying resolution. In April of 1884, on a night when the spring storms were moving through and the prairie was alive with lightning to the west, Grace gave birth to a boy. He came into the world in the bedroom of the farm that had started everything, the farm she had fought for, and kept and made into the center of something she could not have drawn a map of a year and a half ago, healthy and loud and present. Harlan sat beside her bed with his son in his arms and looked at him for a long time without speaking. She watched his face and saw the shadow move through it one more time and then clear completely, not disappear the way losses disappear when you stop thinking about them, but clear the way a sky clears after rain when the light comes in full and new and makes the world look exact. "What do you want to call him?" she asked. He looked up at her. "What do you think of Thomas?" She held very still. "After my husband. After a man who built something worth fighting for," Harlan said. "I think that's a worthy name for a boy who will grow up on the land his father built." Grace looked at him and felt something in her chest that was not quite any word she had for it. "Thomas Monroe," she said, testing the shape of it. "Thomas Monroe," he agreed. Thomas Monroe grew into his name steadily and well. He was dark-haired like his mother, and had Harlan's eyes and Harlan's quality of stillness, that watchful, unhurried way of seeing the world that Grace had come to love so deeply in his father. He took to the horses early, following Harlan around the barn from the time he could walk, watching with the focused attention of a child who is genuinely interested and not just seeking approval. The years between 1884 and 1887 were years of building. The horse operation expanded significantly. Harlan's reputation reached beyond Kansas, and he began to receive inquiries from buyers in Colorado and Oklahoma Territory and as far as New Mexico. He hired 2 more hands and built a 3rd barn and put in a proper breaking corral that became something of a local landmark, people coming from across the county to watch when he worked a difficult horse, which he did with patience and intelligence and the absence of cruelty that was not universal in the trade. The farm continued to produce. Grace kept the cattle herd at a sustainable level, rotated the bottomland leases to maintain the grass quality, expanded the kitchen garden into a proper market garden that she sold from twice a week at the Caldwell market. She had a head for the financial side of things that she had developed in necessity and maintained by choice, and she managed the combined accounts of the farm and the horse operation with a precision that would have satisfied an accountant. Chester Aldridge left Caldwell in the fall of 1884, which was not directly their doing, but was not unrelated to a general deterioration of his position in the community that had begun the morning. He had tried to foreclose on a widow in front of 8 witnesses and been publicly outfaced by a cowboy from the back of the room. The new bank manager was a younger man named Hargreaves, who was professionally sensible and had no interest in predatory practices, and Grace found him perfectly acceptable to deal with and occasionally even pleasant. Davis the teller was still there, and he smiled at Grace now with relief rather than apology, which she thought was an improvement in the relationship. In the summer of 1886, she told Harlan she was pregnant again. He smiled immediately this time, the quick, warm smile that she loved, and then he said, "I was beginning to think Thomas was going to be an only child." "He's not," she said. "Good," he said. "He needs someone to argue with." She gave him a look. "Someone to argue with? You mean someone to teach?" "I mean both," he said. "The arguing is the teaching." She could not entirely disagree. Their second child was a girl, born in February of 1887 during a cold snap that had the water in the washing basin frozen by morning, which seemed like a terrible beginning but was not. She was small and fierce, and had an opinion about everything from her first hour in the world, and they named her Clara after Harlan's mother, who had died when he was young, and whom he had spoken of with the specific tenderness of someone who had been genuinely loved by the person they had lost. Clara Monroe grew up knowing her own mind in the particular way of children who come into a household that has been shaped by a woman who also knew her own mind, which is to say thoroughly, and with no apology for it. She followed her mother around the kitchen garden and the market and the account books, and she followed her father around the barn and the breaking corral, and she followed her brother around whatever he was doing and argued with him about it consistently, which Harlan had predicted and was entirely correct about. By 1888, the Monroe property was the strongest operation in Comanche County. They had 340 acres of combined pasture and bottomland, 50 horses in various stages of the breeding program, a cattle herd of reasonable size, a market garden, and a reputation that was based on the specific quality of work that comes from 2 people building something with genuine intention over several years. Grace was 32. Harlan was 37. Thomas was 4 and Clara was 1. And the second summer barn had a new weather vane that Thomas had helped Harlan put up, a project that had taken most of a Saturday, and involved a great deal of what Harlan called problem-solving and Grace called creative improvisation, and had resulted in a very fine weather vane pointing slightly west of true north, which Thomas thought was perfectly acceptable, and Grace agreed was close enough. On an August evening in 1888, they sat on the porch together after the children were in bed, which was one of the consistent joys of the years they had built. That evening porch time when the day was done, and Thomas was asleep, and Clara had finally run out of opinions for the night, and the bottomland was dark below the house, and the creek was talking and the fireflies were out. Harlan was reading, or had been, and the book was on the railing now and he was just sitting, watching the fireflies, and Grace was thinking about nothing in particular in the good way, the way that is possible when nothing is threatening, and everything that needs to be tended to has been tended to. I keep thinking about that morning, Harlan said. She did not have to ask which morning. I do too, she said, sometimes. When I walked out of that bank, he said, I told myself I was walking out because it was the right thing to do. Wasn't it, she said. It was, he said. But I also knew, on some level I didn't have a word for at the time, that I was walking out because you were walking out, and I wanted to be walking in the same direction you were walking. The fireflies moved below them in the warm dark. In the barn, one of the horses shifted and was quiet. The creek moved over its stones in the way it had moved since long before either of them arrived at this particular bend of it, and would continue moving long after. I'm glad you stood up, she said. I'm glad you didn't move, he said. She looked at him, the way she had been looking at him for 6 years now, with the clear-eyed recognition of someone who has had time to know a person, and has found the knowing to be better than the hoping had been. He looked back at her the same way. You know, she said, I went into that bank that morning expecting to fight alone. I know, he said. I had prepared myself for it completely. I had decided I was capable of it. You were, he said. You would have fought and you might have won, and you certainly would have been right about everything. Yes, she said, but it was different with you there. Was it better, he asked, and there was something careful in the question, a genuine asking. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. Not better, she said finally. More. There was more to it. There was someone beside me instead of space. I had spent 8 months trying to make enough of myself to fill all the space, and you walked in and the space wasn't space anymore. It was just room. Shared room. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across and took her hand the way he had the first time, that August evening of the porch and the fireflies, patient and certain, and offered rather than taken. You are the strongest person I have ever known, he said, and I want to be very clear that I have not helped you. You have built everything. I have just been present for it. That is what help is, Grace said. Half the time. He smiled at her and she smiled back, and the night was warm around them, and the fireflies were doing their small bright work in the grass, and the creek kept its own time, and the house behind them held their children sleeping, Thomas solid and quiet in his room, Clara already beginning to have opinions about her dreams if her small sounds were any indication, and everything that had been uncertain and threatening and alone was now settled and shared and ongoing. There was more ahead of them. There would be harder winters and easier springs, and horses that were difficult and cattle that were troublesome, and a market season in 1890 that was poor, and a season in 1891 that more than made up for it. Thomas would learn to break horses at 14 and would be better at it than most grown men by 16, patient and strong, and with his father's gift for seeing what an animal needed. Clara would grow up arguing about everything with the intelligence and precision of someone who had watched her mother do it to good effect. And when she was 17, she would want to go to school in Wichita, and they would let her because she was right that she needed it, and she was ready, and they had built the kind of lives that could allow for things to expand. There would be evenings on that porch through all of it, and letters written and received, and arguments about the barn and the accounts, and the best way to handle a particular horse, and the supper menu, and the relative merits of various towns in Kansas, and whether the territorial situation to the southwest was going to resolve itself sensibly, which was a conversation that went on for years without a satisfying conclusion. There would be the particular kind of love that is not the love of the beginning, which is urgent and searching and half made of hope, but the love of the long middle, which is made of the specific gravity of knowing someone in all their particulars, the way they hold their coffee cup, and the sound of their voice when they are thinking something through, and the expression they make when they are pretending not to be worried, and the thing they will not say until you ask the right question the right way, and then they will say it completely. But on this August evening in 1888, all of that was simply the future, warm and unread, and theirs. Grace Monroe sat on her own porch on her own land with her husband's hand in hers and her children sleeping behind her. And the bottomland she had once walked into a bank alone to fight for spread out below her in the summer dark. Silver, where the creek caught the last light of the day. And she felt what she had felt that morning when she walked out of the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell, Kansas, with the discharge of her balloon payment in her cloth bag and the sunlight sharp and real on her face. She felt free, and she felt, which was the new part, the part she had not had that morning, not alone in it. The fireflies kept their small, bright vigil in the grass. The horse shifted again in the barn and was quiet. Harlan sat beside her in the warm dark and was here, present and known and choosing, as he had chosen every day of the years since he had stood up from the back of a room and said 3 words that had changed everything. He was with her. He had been with her then, and he was with her now, and the with of it, the simple, enduring with of 2 people who have chosen each other in full knowledge of what choosing costs and what it gives, was the thing she had not known she was missing and had not known she was capable of receiving, and which now, having it, she could not imagine the shape of her days without. The evening moved toward night. The stars came out over the Kansas plain in their uncountable multitude as they always had and would, indifferent to the small dramas and large joys of the people below them, burning at their own ancient distances. Grace watched them and was not afraid of any distance. She had what she needed close beside her, and she knew what it was worth, which is the truest and most permanent form of wealth there is. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.